Listen closely. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive breath or paper. Some houses are built to shelter families. Others are built to shelter crimes. And a very small number are built to train silence itself. Larkspur House was one of those places. If you had stood outside its iron gates in the late 19th century, you would have seen roses climbing white stone, windows glowing warm at dusk, and a name spoken with reverence by bankers, judges, and priests alike. But beauty is often just camouflage for control. And control, when perfected, leaves no screams behind, only obedience. This is not a ghost story. This is a system story. A story about how power learns to hide in manners, inheritance, and ritual. A story about an heiress who never raised her voice, never stained her hands with blood, and yet ruled her servants through chains both visible and invisible. Larkspur House did not need dungeons. It did not need whips. It needed something far more effective: belief. Belief that resistance was pointless. Belief that the walls were watching. Belief that leaving would cost more than staying. The woman at the center of this, Eleanor Ashcombe, was not mad, not impulsive, not cruel in the way history likes to remember villains. She was disciplined, educated, obsessed with order. Born into a collapsing aristocracy, Eleanor inherited Larkspur House at a time when old power structures were rotting from the inside. Servants were beginning to leave. Wages were being questioned. Loyalty was no longer guaranteed by tradition alone. So Eleanor did what institutions always do when authority weakens. She refined control. Contracts at Larkspur House were not employment agreements. They were vows. Servants signed them in a private parlor, beneath a portrait of Eleanor's father, with language deliberately vague, deliberately eternal. Housing, food, protection, and purpose. Those were the promises. In return, servants surrendered movement, correspondence, and in some cases, names. Chains existed, yes, but they were rarely needed, because the most effective restraint is the one a man accepts as normal. Here is the truth most people miss. Larkspur House functioned like a prototype, a small-scale laboratory of institutional domination. Surveillance disguised as care, punishment disguised as correction, privilege disguised as benevolence. This wasn't about sadism. It was about proof. Proof that human behavior could be shaped, contained, and inherited, just like land. As you descend with me, understand this. The reason this story was buried is not because it was unique. It was buried because it worked. Larkspur House did not announce its rules. That was the first lesson. Nothing written on walls. No lists nailed to doors. Order was enforced through atmosphere, through repetition, through the quiet certainty that someone was always aware of where you were supposed to be. Servants learned the rhythms quickly, when to wake, when to move, when to lower their eyes. Those who asked questions were not punished immediately. They were watched. Isolation came later, disguised as concern. "You seem tired," Eleanor would say. "Rest in the East Wing." No one returned unchanged from the East Wing. The chains existed, yes, but not where outsiders expected. They were hidden beneath floorboards, behind false pantry walls, inside linen cupboards built deeper than necessary. Iron links, leather cuffs, polished and maintained. Not relics, tools. But these were not instruments of daily cruelty. They were symbols. Threats made solid. Servants were shown them once, never twice. A single viewing was enough to seed imagination. And imagination, when fed fair, will imprison a man longer than iron ever could. Eleanor Ashcombe understood something most rulers never articulate. People do not obey power. They obey meaning. So she gave Larkspur House meaning. She framed service not as labor, but as elevation. To serve her was to be chosen. To live within those walls was to be protected from the chaos beyond the gates. Poverty, hunger, scandal. She spoke of the outside world as diseased, loud, unstable, dangerous to the soul. And when a man believes the world beyond the fence is worse than the fence itself, the gate no longer needs a lock. Letters were screened. Visitors were rare. When families came asking for daughters or sons who had not written in years, Eleanor welcomed them warmly. Tea was served. Apologies offered. "They are resting," she would say. "The work here is demanding, but noble." And because Eleanor Ashcombe was respected, because her donations built churches and her dinners included officials, no one pressed further. Authority protected authority. That is one of the oldest agreements in human history. What makes this story uncomfortable is not the chains. It is the consent. Many servants stayed for decades. Some defended Eleanor passionately, even after escape. They spoke of structure, purpose, safety. This is where the narrative becomes dangerous, because it exposes a truth men don't like to face. Control feels good when it removes responsibility. Submission feels peaceful when choice has been framed as threat. Larkspur House was not sustained by violence. It was sustained by psychology refined into ritual. And once you see how easily it worked there, you begin to recognize the pattern elsewhere. Eleanor Ashcombe did not invent her methods. She inherited them, filtered through centuries of aristocratic survival. Larkspur House was not just a residence. It was an archive of behaviors, a living manual passed from one generation of power to the next. Hidden in ledgers, marginal notes, and domestic rituals were instructions on how to shape obedience without force. The old families called it keeping order. In truth, it was behavioral engineering before the term existed. Meals were the first instrument. Servants ate after the family, always. Portions varied without explanation. Hunger was never constant, only unpredictable. This wasn't cruelty. It was conditioning. Inconsistent reward creates fixation. A servant never knew whether compliance would be met with abundance or restraint, so they focused obsessively on pleasing the system. Gratitude replaced dignity. Dependence replaced ambition. Sleep was the second instrument. Bells rang at odd hours. Night duties were reassigned without notice. Rest became fragmented, never denied outright but never secure. Fatigue blighs resistance. A tired mind accepts narratives it would reject when whole. Eleanor never needed to argue her authority. Her environment argued for her. Language was a third. Certain words were forbidden, not by rule, but by reaction. Say leave, and conversation cooled. Say family, and Eleanor smiled thinly, correcting gently. We are not family here. We are something better. The servants adopted her phrasing, her cadence, her pauses. Over time, their inner voice stopped sounding like their own. But the most effective mechanism was moral inversion. Punishment was framed as care. Restraint was framed as protection, from oneself, from temptation, from ruin. Those taken to the locked rooms were told they were being preserved, not imprisoned. And when they returned quieter, thinner, more obedient, the others learned the lesson without ever seeing the cost. Records suggest at least 3 servants attempted escape. Only one made it beyond the grounds. The others were found wandering the estate at dawn, barefoot, disoriented, apologetic. They did not accuse. They begged forgiveness. This is the detail historians gloss over, because it threatens the comforting idea that evil must look monstrous. Sometimes it looks like a well-lit hallway and a calm voice telling you that freedom is dangerous. By the time authorities finally investigated, spurred by an unrelated inheritance dispute, there were no bodies, no chains in use, no bruises to photograph. Servants testified willingly in Eleanor's favor. The case dissolved. Larkspur House remained untouched. And here's the deeper truth. Eleanor did not fail because she was exposed. She succeeded because a system mirrored larger ones already in place. Courts, churches, factories, schools, each recognized something familiar in her methods. To condemn her would have meant condemning themselves. So the house endured, and the knowledge it refined did not die with her. After Eleanor's death, Larkspur House did not collapse the way scandals are supposed to. There were no mass departures, no sudden confessions, no reckoning. The servants held a vigil. Candles were lit. Her body lay in the great hall, surrounded by people who had once been chained and now wept as if they had lost a savior. This is the moment that should disturb you most, because it reveals the final stage of control, gratitude toward the captor. The will was precise, obsessive. Eleanor left the house not to a single heir, but to a trust, an institution without a face. The language of the document spoke of continuity, preservation, and standards. Servants were invited, not required, to remain under the new administration. Almost all did. The system did not need her anymore. That is the mark of a perfected structure. It outlives its creator. What changed was not the rules, but the visibility. Physical restraints were removed entirely. Locked rooms became storage. The east wing was repurposed. Outsiders toured the gardens. Charities held luncheons in the drawing room. Larkspur House became an example of progressive stewardship, an aristocratic estate that had modernized without losing tradition. The same psychological architecture remained, just cleaned and rebranded. Some of the older servants struggled. Without chains, their sense of purpose wavered. They had been shaped around resistance and restraint. Freedom, offered suddenly, felt like abandonment. This is another truth rarely spoken. Systems of domination do not only trap people, they replace parts of them. Remove the system, and you remove identity. That loss can feel worse than captivity. Over time, the staff turned over. New workers arrived under normal contracts. They came and went. Larkspur House functioned like any other estate. And yet, certain habits persisted. Silence in hallways. Avoidance of particular rooms. A reluctance to speak certain thoughts aloud. The building itself seemed to teach behavior. Architecture can do that. So can culture. In the 1930s, a historian requested access to Eleanor's private papers. The trust denied the request. Not aggressively. Politely. Repeatedly. Years later, the papers were reported destroyed due to water damage. No copies surfaced. No transcripts. The official record ends with philanthropy and quiet decline. But unofficial records survive in fragments, letters written by descendants of servants, half-remembered warnings, dreams passed down without context. They speak of a house that trained obedience the way other places train soldiers. A place where control was not enforced, but absorbed. Here's why this matters to you. Larkspur House is not an anomaly. It is a microcosm. A demonstration of how power prefers to operate, through environment, narrative, and reward structures so subtle that those inside defend them voluntarily. Once you recognize that pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. There is a reason stories like Larkspur House are filed under local legend instead of institutional history. Legends are safe. They keep danger contained in the past. Institutions, on the other hand, are uncomfortable to question, because they are still operating. Eleanor Ashcombe didn't just run a house. She ran a model. One that proved human beings could be managed long-term without visible force, as long as the system controlled three things: dependency, narrative, and fear of exile. Dependency came first. Every servant at Larkspur House relied on the estate not only for wages, but for identity. Their skills were hyper-specialized. Their social ties were internal. Their sense of worth was measured by proximity to Eleanor's approval. Leave the house, and you left behind not just income, but relevance. Modern systems learned this lesson well. Make exit costly, not physically, but psychologically, and most people will never test the door. Narrative came next. Eleanor controlled the story servants told themselves about who they were and where they stood in the world. They were not exploited. They were chosen. They were not restricted. They were protected. Language didn't describe reality. It replaced it. Once a man adopts the language of his cage, he begins to maintain it himself. Fear of exile was the final layer. Eleanor never exaggerated the dangers of the outside world. She didn't have to. Poverty, illness, and instability were real enough. She simply framed Larkspur House as the last civilized refuge against a collapsing society. And when people believe the world beyond the walls is hostile, they will cling to any authority that promises order, even if that authority is the source of their confinement. This is why Larkspur House didn't need guards. It didn't need bars on windows. The servants policed one another. Deviance was discouraged socially. Doubt was treated as illness. Obedience became a moral virtue. These are the hallmarks of a closed system, and they are still used today, refined and scaled. What Eleanor proved is this: the most resilient prisons are not built of stone. They are built of incentives. They are defended not by soldiers, but by the very people inside them. And when such a system is exposed, it rarely collapses. It adapts. It renames itself. It spreads. You were taught to look for tyranny in raised voices, uniforms, and violence. That teaching was deliberate. Real control prefers to whisper. It prefers comfort over coercion. It prefers that you never realize a decision was made for you, because then you will defend it as your own. Larkspur House is gone now, at least in form. But the knowledge refined within its walls was never destroyed. It was absorbed by corporations, by bureaucracies, by cultural norms that reward obedience and punish independence quietly, efficiently, and without apology. And once you see that, the question is no longer what happened there. The question becomes, where are you standing right now? There is an uncomfortable moment every man reaches when he realizes the story isn't pulling him toward the past, it's circling his present. Larkspur House was not dangerous because of its walls. It was dangerous because it revealed how easily human beings trade autonomy for stability when uncertainty is framed as threat. Eleanor Ashcombe didn't invent fear. She curated it. She aimed it. She rationed it like food. Look closer at how the servants described their lives after leaving. Those who managed to leave at all. They struggled with decision-making. Simple choices caused anxiety. Freedom felt loud, chaotic, even hostile. This wasn't weakness. It was conditioning withdrawal. When a system makes every choice for you long enough, self-direction feels like falling without gravity. This is why institutions rarely need to chase defectors. Most come back voluntarily, or recreate the same structure elsewhere. Former servants took positions where hierarchy was strict, rules were clear, and authority was unquestioned. The cage had moved inside them. Eleanor understood this outcome intuitively. A man trained to obey will seek someone to obey long after the master is gone. What makes Larkspur House especially revealing is that it operated without ideology. No politics. No religion. No grand manifesto. Just order. Just standards. Just the way things are done. This is how the most enduring systems survive scrutiny. They appear neutral, technical, practical, above morality. When control disguises itself as common sense, resistance looks irrational. The trust that inherited the estate quietly studied Eleanor's records before destroying them. We know this from marginal notes found in a secondary ledger, references to efficiency, retention, and compliance. Those words should sound familiar. They belong to the modern world. The knowledge tested in Larkspur House did not vanish. It was abstracted, stripped of chains and names, then reapplied where it could scale. You were taught that freedom is about having options. That is incomplete. Freedom is about bearing consequence. Systems like Eleanor's remove consequence by absorbing risk. They promise to handle uncertainty for you, if you surrender discretion. And many men accept that bargain without ever recognizing it as a bargain. This is where the descent deepens. Because once you understand that control can feel safe, benevolent, even nurturing, you begin to question your own comforts. Which structures in your life reward silence? Which punish deviation not with force, but with withdrawal of status, income, belonging? Larkspur House trained obedience so thoroughly that it no longer required enforcement. That is the endgame of all refined power. Not domination, but internalization. And once control lives inside a man, he will call it discipline. There's a reason Eleanor Ashcombe never spoke about loyalty. Loyalty implies choice. Choice implies the possibility of refusal. Instead, she cultivated alignment. Alignment feels natural. It feels inevitable. When a man believes his interests and the system's interests are the same, resistance no longer registers as an option. It feels like self-harm. At Larkspur House, alignment was trained through repetition. Daily routines never varied in structure, only in consequence. Praise came unexpectedly. Correction came quietly. Over time, servants stopped acting to avoid punishment and started acting to maintain internal equilibrium. They weren't trying to please Eleanor anymore. They were trying to silence discomfort inside themselves. That is the moment control becomes self-sustaining. This is where historians make their greatest mistake. They look for moments of rebellion and find very few. They conclude the servants must have been content, or at least complicit. But the absence of rebellion does not signal satisfaction. It signals success. The system had moved past the need for force. It had rewritten instinct. One recovered letter, never officially authenticated, but consistent with multiple accounts, describes a servant who dreamed of open fields and woke in panic, not relief. The dream represented choice. And choice, after long conditioning, feels like danger. This is what Larkspur House truly produced, not obedience, but ovation to freedom. Eleanor understood something modern psychology would not formally describe for decades. The human nervous system prefers predictable constraint over unpredictable liberty. A narrow corridor you know is safer than a vast landscape you don't. So she made the corridor elegant, comfortable, meaningful. And once servants learned to navigate it flawlessly, they defended it with pride. Outsiders often asked why no one ever spoke ill of the house. The answer is simple and devastating. Speaking ill would have meant admitting their lives had been shaped without consent, and most people would rather defend a lie than confront that level of loss. This is where the story stops being about Eleanor Ashcombe at all, because her methods did not require wealth, or lineage, or even property. They required insight into human fear. Fear of exclusion. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of standing alone without a script. Every refined system of control follows the same trajectory. First, it offers protection. Then, it defines normal. Finally, it makes deviation feel immoral, dangerous, or insane. By the end, the individual no longer asks, "Is this right?" He asks, "What's wrong with me for questioning it?" Larkspur House did not need to survive as a building. Its true architecture was psychological, portable, invisible, and once you learn to recognize that architecture, you begin to notice how often it appears, wherever order is valued more than truth. The descent continues from here. What unsettles most men when they first grasp this is not anger, it's recognition, a quiet, creeping sense of familiarity. Because Larkspur House did not rely on secrecy alone. It relied on normalization. Its greatest weapon was time. Given enough repetition, even the unnatural becomes routine. Even chains become furniture. Consider how newcomers were integrated. They were never overwhelmed. They were eased in. First, small rules. Then traditions. Then unspoken expectations. Each step felt reasonable on its own. No single moment demanded resistance. And that is precisely the point. Systems that intend to dominate never present themselves as cages all at once. They assemble themselves around you while you're busy adjusting. Eleanor Ashcombe understood pacing. She understood that sudden oppression creates heroes, but gradual restriction creates caretakers. By the time a servant realized how narrow their world had become, their survival depended on maintaining it. To question the system would have been to dismantle the scaffolding holding their life together. There's a term whispered in older institutional psychology texts: habituated captivity. It describes a condition where individuals no longer perceive restriction as restriction. They perceive it as reality. Larkspur House didn't just house servants. It trained perception. It taught people what to notice and, more importantly, what to ignore. Sight and sounds disappeared first. Doors closing. Keys turning. Footsteps at night. Then sight and thoughts faded. Curiosity. Comparison. The idea that life could be otherwise. When perception narrows, imagination follows. And when imagination dies, escape becomes unthinkable, not because it's impossible, but because it's unimaginable. This is why Eleanor rarely had to intervene directly. The system corrected itself. Servants corrected each other. Concern replaced coercion. Don't think that way, they'd say. It's not healthy. Dissent was reframed as instability. And once deviation is medicalized or moralized, suppression feels like kindness. Ask yourself this: who benefits when questioning is treated as dysfunction? Who gains when conformity is described as maturity? These are not abstract questions. They are the quiet foundations of every enduring hierarchy. Larkspur House was a closed environment, yes, but its principles were never meant to stay contained. They were meant to be exported into factories, offices, doctrines, cultures, anywhere humans could be convinced that safety lies in submission and that uncertainty is the enemy. The deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. The true danger was never the heiress or the house. It was the demonstration. Proof that men can be guided into surrendering themselves, and then taught to defend the surrender as wisdom. Once that lesson is learned, it doesn't unlearn easily, and the descent is far from over. There is a moment in every controlled system when compliance stops being enough, when obedience alone no longer satisfies the architecture of power. That is when belief must be installed. Larkspur House reached that phase quietly, without ceremony. Eleanor Ashcombe did not demand faith in her authority. She engineered faith in the necessity of the structure itself. Servants were encouraged to see the house as fragile, constantly at risk, threatened by outside misunderstanding, by political change, by moral decay beyond the gates. This was not paranoia. It was strategy. When people believe a system is under siege, they will tolerate measures they would otherwise reject. Restrictions become temporary. Silence becomes responsible. Endurance becomes virtue. This is where many men misunderstand control. They imagine it as something imposed from above. In reality, The most effective systems recruit their own enforcers. At Larkspur House, senior servants became guardians of tradition. They corrected posture, tone, even facial expressions. Not because Eleanor demanded it, but because deviation felt like betrayal. The system had acquired defenders, and defenders are more dangerous than jailers. One account speaks of a young maid who laughed too loudly during supper service. No punishment followed. Instead, the others avoided her. Conversations ended when she entered a room. Duties were reassigned. She became invisible. Within weeks, she apologized publicly, without being asked, for disrupting the order. The system did not need to punish her. It taught her to punish herself. This is the turning point where control becomes culture. Eleanor understood that fear alone is unstable. Fear creates resentment. But belonging, conditional belonging, creates loyalty. At Larkspur House, inclusion was never guaranteed. It was earned daily through alignment. The fear was not of pain. It was of exclusion, of being cut loose from the only reality that made sense. This is why exposure never destroyed the house. Even when rumors surfaced, even when questions were asked, the internal narrative held. Outsiders wouldn't understand. Critics were dangerous. Scrutiny was an attack. Every challenge strengthened cohesion. This is not accidental. It is the immune system of controlled environments. Pay attention here, because this pattern repeats everywhere power wishes to endure. Create a shared identity. Frame the world as hostile. Define dissent as threat. Then step back and let the group police itself. By this stage, Eleanor was almost irrelevant. The system ran on internal momentum. She had done what all successful architects of control aim to do: make herself unnecessary. And when a system no longer needs a master, it becomes very difficult to dismantle, because there is no single villain left to blame. When a system reaches this stage, something subtle happens to time itself. Past and future compress into an endless present where change feels unnecessary and movement feels suspicious. Larkspur House entered that phase long before Eleanor's death. Days blurred. Seasons mattered only as they affected duties. History became irrelevant. The future was spoken of only in terms of maintenance, keeping things as they were. This is one of the most powerful psychological locks ever discovered. Remove a man's sense of trajectory, and you remove his reason to rebel. Without a future to aim for, resistance feels childish. Without a past to compare against, the present feels permanent. Larkspur House did not trap bodies. It flattened time. Servants stopped marking birthdays. Years of service were noted, but never celebrated. Aging happened quietly, almost shamefully. Youth was useful. Age was invisible. This ensured another form of compliance. People learned not to imagine themselves elsewhere. Older, wiser, free. The house became the only timeline that mattered. Eleanor rarely spoke of legacy, but her system did. It rewarded those who trained newcomers correctly. Knowledge passed horizontally, not vertically. No manuals, no written doctrine, just imitation. Watch how others behave. Do the same. This ensured that control felt organic, not imposed. And anything organic feels difficult to question, because it seems natural. Men often ask how something like this could exist without public outrage. The answer is not ignorance. It's saturation. Outrage requires contrast. Larkspur House existed in a society already steeped in hierarchy, obedience, and deference. Against that backdrop, it didn't look extreme. It looked efficient, respectable, even admirable. That is the danger of relative morality. When the surrounding world is already restrictive, the more refined cage looks like order, not oppression. Eleanor didn't need to push boundaries. She simply perfected what was already socially acceptable and removed the messiness of overt farce. And here's where the story sharpens into something personal. Because every era produces its own Larkspur houses. They rarely look like prisons. They look like opportunities, careers, movements, paths. They promise clarity in a chaotic world. They offer identity in exchange for submission. And they punish deviation not with pain, but with erasure. Ask yourself, not emotionally, but honestly, where in your life is time flattened? Where is the future reduced to maintenance? Where is questioning treated as immaturity rather than strength? The deeper lesson of Larkspur House is not that people were controlled. It's that they stopped expecting anything else. Once expectation dies, freedom doesn't feel stolen. It feels irrelevant. And that is the most dangerous state a man can enter, when he no longer believes there is something more to claim. By the time Eleanor Ashcombe reached her late 40s, Larkspur House had become a living organism, independent of its creator yet reflecting her mind in every detail. She walked the halls quietly, observing, noting, correcting, but rarely intervening. The system no longer required her hands. It required only her presence as a stabilizing signal, a reminder that the architecture of control had a conscious mind behind it. Psychologically, this is where genius and danger meet. Eleanor understood that the most resilient control is invisible. Walls can be torn down, chains can be cut, orders can be ignored. But perception, belief, that can persist for decades, even generations. Once a man believes the house is his measure of reality, he will defend it instinctively, and he will defend it not for her, but for himself. Visitors who toured Larkspur House after her death described something they could not articulate. A sense of rightness in the alignment of halls, furniture, routines, even the way light fell across the floors. It was oppressive in a peculiar way, not violent, but insistently ordered. One historian noted that the house seemed to breathe discipline. That is not metaphor. That is the psychological echo of a system that taught obedience so thoroughly that it became tangible. Eleanor's personal habits reinforced this invisible structure. She never raised her voice unnecessarily. She spoke in measured cadences, correcting without anger, rewarding without predictability. Her calm became a lesson, her approval a currency, her gaze a subtle but constant measure of alignment. Servants learned to anticipate her presence in the same way soldiers anticipate a drill sergeant, except there was no uniform, no ceremony, no threat of public shame. Just certainty. Perhaps the most dangerous mechanism of all was anticipation. Eleanor trained people to anticipate outcomes before they happened. Small failures were corrected preemptively. Deviations were framed as misjudgments of self, not defiance. Over time, servants began policing themselves. They adjusted posture, tone, and thought, not because they were told, but because they had internalized the expected norms. Control had become self-replicating. Here is the crucial insight. The most enduring form of domination is mental sovereignty surrendered voluntarily. The moment a man chooses to regulate his behavior according to a system, without external force, he becomes both prisoner and god. And once that internalized control exists, removing it becomes far more difficult than removing walls or locks. This is why Larkspur House survived scandal. This is why Eleanor's methods outlasted her. And this is why the descent is irreversible once you recognize the machinery at work. Not just in a single house, but within the societies we inhabit, the organizations we serve, and even within the quiet corners of our own minds. The servants who lived long enough within Larkspur House often described a strange transformation. At first, they felt fear, then obedience, then relief. Finally, an almost imperceptible pride. They became something that had never existed before. Humans conditioned to defend their own subjugation. This is the apex of psychological control, when compliance evolves into identity, and the prisoner's self-concept aligns with the cage itself. One diary fragment, hidden for decades and later corroborated by multiple descendants, described a woman who had arrived timid, eager to flee, but left 20 years later speaking of Larkspur House as a world apart, safer than the outside, purer than life itself. Notice the words, safety, separation, purity. None of these are coercion. They are framing devices. They are the invisible locks around thought and perception. Eleanor's genius lay in understanding the human desire for purpose. Work alone is insufficient. Repetition alone is insufficient. People will endure hardship for reward, but they will revere hardship framed as necessity. At Larkspur, every rule, every chain, every hidden room, every unpredictable consequence was framed as essential to the greater order. Those inside internalized it. They came to see the system as inevitable and themselves as indispensable to its preservation. Here is where most men falter when they study control. They look for brutality and miss the architecture. True mastery is subtle. True influence does not demand attention. True submission does not feel like captivity. The servants rarely spoke ill of Eleanor not because they feared her, but because they feared the loss of the world she had created. A world whose logic they had absorbed so thoroughly that leaving it felt incomprehensible. And yet, cracks existed. In moments of silence, some questioned their choices. They wondered whether life outside the walls might be different. But the house had trained them to distrust their own impulses. Doubt became dangerous, not because Eleanor punished it, but because the community reframed it as instability. Even the act of questioning was policed, internally, without the need for iron or chains. This is the mechanism modern systems have borrowed, knowingly or not, normalize dependence, instill identity in alignment with structure, and let the individual monitor themselves. When control is internalized, enforcement is nearly invisible. Rewards, consequences, routines, all are tools to reinforce self-surveillance. Resistance becomes an act of self-betrayal, and that is the cruelest lesson of all. Take a moment here, because the descent is about to deepen further. Once the mind is trained to defend the cage voluntarily, the cage no longer belongs to anyone but the subject. It lives in memory, habit, and belief. It is at this point you must confront an uncomfortable truth. The techniques perfected in Larkspur House were not confined to a single estate or a single era. Eleanor Ashcombe's methods, the layering of dependency, ritual, and internalized correction, are visible in modern systems everywhere. Corporations, governments, religious institutions, even digital platforms operate on the same psychological architecture. Obedience is rarely demanded, it is absorbed. Freedom is rarely blocked, it is made uncomfortable. Consider the modern office. Schedules, monitoring, subtle peer pressure, performance reviews, hierarchy, and the cultivation of culture. On the surface, these are efficiency tools. Beneath, they echo Eleanor's lessons. Reward unpredictably. Correct quietly. Normalize scrutiny. Teach individuals to evaluate themselves by the system's standards. Encourage self-surveillance. The human mind has not changed. The patterns are the same. Social media functions similarly. Algorithms dictate what we see, shaping perception. Likes, shares, and comments are the modern equivalent of Eleanor's praise or correction. Over time, people internalize these cues. They edit themselves before exposure. They measure their thoughts, speech, and even desires against a perceived standard. Voluntary control, reinforced constantly, becomes identity. Chains are invisible. Obedience feels like choice. Now, pause. This is where your role becomes active, not passive. Understanding Larkspur House is not merely curiosity. It is recognition. To see the mechanics of control is to begin reclaiming autonomy. And autonomy is uncomfortable. Because when you question structures you were trained to defend, you feel anxiety, fear, and disorientation, the same sensations that kept the servants aligned for decades. If you are ready to take the next step, I need you to do something now. Comment below the phrase "I see the hidden chain" twice. Write it. Feel it. Commit to observing, not reacting. This is symbolic. It is a small ritual that solidifies awareness and engages the algorithmic world as a participant in your transformation. Once done, continue reading or listening with sharpened focus, because the descent is no longer about someone else's house. It is about the structures within your mind, the unseen forces shaping your choices, the invisible gates you pass through daily. Eleanor's methods are not unique. They are universal. They are enduring. And now, for the first time, you can witness them consciously. Perception is the final frontier of control. Larkspur House didn't merely dictate action, it dictated reality. Eleanor Ashcombe understood that if you could reshape how someone perceives the world, you could shape everything else: emotion, thought, desire, even memory. To the servants, the estate was not merely a building. It was a universe, a moral authority, a lens through which every choice was filtered. Small manipulations amplified over time became invisible to the mind itself. A servant sent to the East Wing for rest remembered it as a lesson in responsibility. A ration meal became a lesson in moderation. A denied request became a lesson in patience. By reframing every interaction as education, Eleanor converted deprivation into virtue. The system taught them to value their own subjugation. This is where obedience becomes devotion. Reality itself was curated. What was outside the walls was painted as chaotic, dangerous, morally corrupt. What was inside was orderly, refined, meaningful. The servants didn't just obey. They internalized the hierarchy. They defended it. They reproduced it. And over decades, even their memories of the outside world warped. Freedom, when glimpsed, appeared hazardous. The cage had become preferable. This is subtle, but it is the most powerful lesson Larkspur House offers. The mind, once trained, becomes a tool for its own confinement. Chains are unnecessary when belief is complete. Punishment is unnecessary when instinct enforces compliance. The house operated silently, invisibly, because the subjects themselves maintained it, policing thoughts, suppressing doubt, and rationalizing constraint as benevolence. Modern parallels are everywhere. Systems that control perception, media, education, institutions, don't need to compel action openly. They shape understanding, define normal, and convince individuals that the cage is safe, inevitable, or even virtuous. Once the lens is fixed, reality bends to it. Resistance feels unnatural, dangerous, even immoral. Here's where your awareness becomes urgent. Recognition alone is not enough. Understanding the mechanisms at work, how dependency, anticipation, social reinforcement, and perception shaping interact, is essential if you intend to reclaim autonomy. Without recognition, your own mind may already be practicing the same obedience, defending the same invisible chains, just as the servants did. The descent continues, deeper and darker. Next, we will examine the rituals, routines, and small daily corrections that turned Larkspur House from a home into a self-replicating machine of compliance, a machine that left permanent marks on its inhabitants' identities and psyches. Rituals are the mortar that bind any system of control. At Larkspur House, Eleanor Ashcombe understood this instinctively. Daily routines were not arbitrary, they were instruments of conditioning. Meals served at precise intervals, tasks assigned with exacting sequence, chores repeated until motion became automatic. These were the visible threads of a far more insidious loom. They trained bodies, yes, but more importantly, they trained minds. Every step, every action, reinforced hierarchy. Stand here. Speak when spoken to. Pause before moving. Wait for permission that was never explicitly denied but implied everywhere. Over time, the servants ceased to act out of instruction. They acted out of anticipation. The system did not command, they internalized the commands. Obedience had become instinct. Even small deviations were addressed not through punishment, but through ritualized correction. A misaligned chair would be silently returned to its exact position. A mispronounced word corrected with quiet repetition. A glance considered too long would draw a measured look from a senior servant. These microcorrections communicated far more than punishment ever could. They signaled that attention itself was being monitored, and that perfection, however defined, was expected. Ritual also normalized stress. By integrating subtle tension into everyday tasks, Eleanor created a state of controlled anxiety. Servants never relaxed completely. They were alert, vigilant, yet lulled into the belief that these conditions were natural. This is a hallmark of sophisticated psychological control. The individual defends the stress as necessary and interprets compliance as virtue. Then there was social reinforcement. Those who excelled in adherence were subtly elevated. Praise was unpredictable. Recognition, rare. Competition was encouraged quietly. Deviants, those who questioned or resisted, were isolated, not overtly punished. Their discomfort became a warning to others. Surveillance became social, and social became internalized. By the time the outsider noticed, compliance had become a choice they themselves endorsed. Here lies the most dangerous lesson for any man who studies Larkspur House. Power does not need to shout. It whispers, manipulates patterns, and co-opts self-interest. Ritual is its most silent weapon. It can reshape perception, habituate obedience, and create loyalty without ever breaking a bone. Identity is the ultimate target of any system that seeks permanence. Larkspur House did not merely train behavior. It reshaped the self. Eleanor Ashcombe understood that a man who acts differently from his own desire is temporarily obedient. A man who believes differently from his own judgment is permanently controlled. Over decades, the house cultivated both, embedding itself into the very psyche of its inhabitants. Servants were not allowed to separate their duties from their sense of self. Tasks were moralized. Cleaning became virtue. Silence became discipline. Attention became loyalty. They were not simply performing, they were becoming. Eleanor's presence, rituals, and corrections served as constant calibration, reinforcing the narrative that the house was the measure of rightness, and that deviation was both unsafe and morally flawed. Even private thoughts were trained. Eleanor's quiet, observant gaze taught servants to censor their own imagination. Curiosity about the outside world became guilt. Desire for independence became anxiety. Obedience was internalized to such an extent that resistance felt like betrayal, not of Eleanor, but of the self. The house became the lens through which every action and thought was filtered, and over time, it became indistinguishable from the servant's own consciousness. This is the point where fear evolves into devotion. Chains, rooms, and tasks were no longer necessary. Internalized correction ensured that compliance persisted even without supervision. Former missteps became memories of weakness. Servants recalled them with shame, not anger. The house had rewritten history inside their minds, converting past rebellion into cautionary tale. Even moral frameworks were influenced. What the servants considered ethical was bounded by the system. Rules were framed as universal truths, not arbitrary commands. Breaking them was interpreted as corruption. Upholding them became a reflection of personal virtue. Eleanor's genius lay in making the framework appear natural, inevitable, and just. When the cage is moral, leaving it feels wrong. At this stage, control has become permanent. Systems of power do not need to watch you if you have learned to police yourself. They do not need to punish when you reinterpret transgression as weakness. Identity itself has been conditioned to serve the structure. This is where Larkspur House achieves immortality, not through walls or wealth, but through the very consciousness of those who lived within it. And now, as we continue, the descent will show how this invisible dominance extends far beyond the walls of any single estate, into the patterns of society itself. Control becomes immortal when it teaches replication. Larkspur House was not a static system, it was a template. Eleanor Ashcombe understood that behaviors, once internalized, could propagate. Senior servants became instructors, training newcomers with quiet insistence. Deviance was corrected by peers, not masters. Over time, the rules of the house extended beyond the heiress herself, carried forward by those who had been shaped most thoroughly. This is how institutional power spreads. Systems rarely need architects once their patterns are ingrained. Humans, by nature, reproduce learned hierarchies. They recruit allies, correct subordinates, and normalize rituals. The house trained this instinct expertly. By the time outsiders observed, obedience appeared natural, almost voluntary. The machinery of control was invisible because it was internalized and self-replicating. Consider the social implications. Once a servant had lived under such rigorous conditioning, they were unlikely to leave. But even if they did, they carried the methodology with them. Subtle timing of rewards, carefully calibrated praise, quiet peer corrections, these were skills transferable to other domains. Larkspur House was a crucible of behavioral engineering, and its alumni dispersed like seeds. Eleanor's system was thus both microcosm and prototype. It functioned internally, producing compliance and identity, while simultaneously modeling patterns for external replication. The lessons were psychological, not material: anticipation, ritual, moralization, internalized correction. Chains, rooms, even punishments were optional. Once the mind accepts the system, the cage travels wherever the subject goes. This is why studying Larkspur House is more than historical curiosity. It is a manual in human dynamics, hidden in plain sight. Every corporation, bureaucracy, religious order, or institution that emphasizes loyalty, conformity, and ritual over critical thinking echoes these principles. You can see the same architecture in cultures that valorize obedience, suppress deviation, and reward alignment with unspoken norms. Here is the pivotal insight: control is most durable when it is invisible to the individual. Those inside defend it as justice. Those outside recognize it as order. And both fail to see the chain extending through perception, identity, and habit. Once this internal replication occurs, the system is essentially immortal. The emotional architecture of Larkspur House was as precise as its physical one. Fear was only the first layer. Once obedience became instinct, deeper emotions took root: pride, guilt, anxiety, and even devotion. Servants did not simply follow rules, they felt them. Compliance became a source of identity, and deviation a source of shame. The line between self-interest and system interest blurred until it disappeared entirely. Pride was cultivated quietly. Doing one's duties correctly was framed as moral excellence. Tasks were never meaningless, they were elevated to ritual. Silence in corridors, exact alignment of furniture, anticipation of Eleanor's gaze, each became markers of virtue. The servants internalized this. They took pride in their conformity, in their ability to navigate the invisible expectations of the house. Obedience was no longer forced. It became a source of self-worth. Guilt followed closely. Any lapse, any thought of leaving, any curiosity about the outside world became a moral transgression. It was punished not through chains or reprimands, but through self-reproach. The system had trained them to administer correction internally. Once guilt is internalized, punishment is no longer needed. The mind becomes its own warden. Anxiety lingered perpetually. Uncertainty, small deviations, even idle thoughts could trigger subtle cues of discomfort from peers or seniors. Over time, this conditioned vigilance became second nature. Sleep was punctuated by unease. Choices outside routine felt unnatural. The world beyond the gates appeared hostile, chaotic, untrustworthy. Anxiety reinforced submission, keeping the mind loyal without force. Devotion emerged naturally from these layers. When identity, pride, guilt, and fear align perfectly with the system, allegiance becomes instinctive. The servants did not serve Eleanor Ashcombe merely because they were ordered. They served because they believed in the logic of a house, and because they had absorbed its value so thoroughly that they defended it even in her absence. This is the psychological apex of any controlled environment. Chains are unnecessary. Punishment is redundant. Even the master can vanish, and the system continues, self-perpetuating, defended by those it shaped most completely. The house becomes more than a structure. It becomes a repository of mindsets, a living organism that survives through internalized emotion. Here is the moment where the descent deepens, when the cage is no longer physical, but emotional, and the inmates' own feelings enforce their confinement. The next section will reveal the hidden mechanisms Eleanor used to entwine loyalty with morality, turning obedience into sacred duty, and leaving her subjects incapable of questioning their own captivity. Loyalty at Larkspur House was never demanded. It was earned through moral architecture. Eleanor Ashcombe understood that men obey authority more willingly when obedience feels ethical. She embedded virtue into every action, every rule, every expectation. The servants came to believe that following the system was not only correct, but righteous. Disobedience became sin, not rebellion. Consider the lessons implicit in everyday tasks. Cleaning a hallway, adjusting a chair, tending the gardens. Each chore was framed as service to something greater. Doing it poorly was framed as moral failing. Doing it well was framed as contributing to a higher order. Over time, obedience was no longer an external requirement. It became a moral compass. The servants aligned their judgment with the house itself. Punishment, when it existed, was similarly reframed. A warning, a correction, even isolation, was presented as guidance, not cruelty. The narrative was consistent. The house exists for the good of all, and the individual's deviation endangers not just themselves, but the order, the collective. Fear was moralized. Discipline was elevated. Anxiety became virtue in miniature. This is the mechanism of internalized compliance at its most potent. By entwining loyalty with morality, Eleanor ensured that her subjects would defend her system voluntarily. Leaving would feel not like escape, but betrayal. Questioning would feel not like independence, but corruption. Obedience became identity, and identity became the cage. The power of moral framing is subtle but absolute. Once a system is perceived as inherently just, it no longer needs enforcers. Its defenders will appear willingly. Its principles become sacred. And the more a person internalizes this morality, the more they self-regulate. The house could vanish, Eleanor could die, and the order would persist, embedded in mind and habit. Pay attention to this pattern. It exists beyond Larkspur House. Organizations, governments, and social movements replicate it constantly. Ethical framing, ritualized compliance, anticipation of reward and shame. These are the tools of every enduring system. The methods are ancient, refined, and terrifyingly effective. And here's your next step. To anchor your awareness, comment again the phrase "I see the hidden chain" twice. Feel the recognition of these mechanisms, and acknowledge them consciously. Once you do, you will understand the next layer. How faith, ritual, and morality converge to make resistance feel impossible, and how the mind itself becomes the jailer. The convergence of faith, ritual, and morality is where Larkspur House achieved near perfection. Individually, each element shapes behavior. Together, they reshape consciousness. Fear primes the mind, making it vigilant and pliable. Ritual organizes action, converting effort into habit. Moral framing transforms compliance into self-justifying belief. Lead. These forces render resistance psychologically unnatural. At Larkspur, fear was subtle. It was not shouted or branded into flesh. It existed as potential consequence, as whispers of the outside world's dangers, as the memory of those who faltered. Anticipation of correction, never harsh, always precise, kept servants aligned before intervention was necessary. Fear became a constant undertone, not a spike, and constant undertones are absorbed into perception as reality. Ritual reinforced this subtly, invisibly. Every day followed an orchestrated sequence: waking, tasks, meals, duties, observation, sleep. The order itself became a stabilizing force. Predictability comforts the conditioned mind, but predictability paired with moral framing binds it. Actions once tedious or arbitrary gained meaning. Obedience was experienced not as restraint, but as participation in an orderly universe. Moral framing completed the process. Disobedience was not merely wrong, it was dangerous, shameful, corrupt. Actions aligned with the system became virtuous. Compliance was celebrated internally as righteousness. A servant who doubted themselves doubted morality itself. Eleanor Ashcombe had built a world in which questioning was not just futile, it felt immoral. The house had become a moral arbiter. This triad, fear, ritual, morality, created a feedback loop. Fear triggered vigilance. Ritual normalized action. Morality justified compliance. Internal monitors policed behavior. Deviations were self-corrected. Loyalty became automatic. Obedience became identity. By the time a servant realized the magnitude of their submission, it was already a permanent part of who they were. And here's the most chilling insight: this mechanism is timeless. Anywhere humans inhabit structured hierarchies, the same principles operate. Modern institutions refine them with psychological subtlety, hiding control behind ethics, structure, and expectation. Most men never recognize the chain because it is defended from within, by the very person it confines. The east wing of Larkspur House was more than a section of the building. It was a classroom for the mind. Rooms once locked for punishment, once hidden behind false walls, became instruments of subtle teaching. Not overt force, not visible cruelty, but lessons in anticipation, patience, and self-restraint. The architecture itself was a silent instructor, shaping behavior without a word. Each room had a purpose, though not obvious to outsiders. One room contained barely enough furniture, forcing posture, focus, and attention to detail. Another was silent, isolated, its emptiness designed to reflect the mind back to the servant. A third contained objects arranged in precise order, requiring meticulous care. The lesson was always the same: the environment dictates conduct, and conduct shapes character. Movement through the wing was ritualized. Servants entered, paused, observed, and executed tasks according to unspoken rules. Any deviation, even minor, was noted, corrected indirectly, and internalized. Eleanor understood that repetition in controlled spaces forms habits deeper than any verbal instruction. The mind learns from structure more reliably than from argument. Symbolism permeated the design. Locks, even when unused, were visible. Chains polished and displayed reminded residents of potential consequences. Mirrors reflected more than faces. They reflected posture, composure, attention, and alignment with expectation. Each spatial cue reinforced vigilance, shaping identity without overt punishment. The house taught itself into the mind. This is why Eleanor rarely needed to intervene. Physical barriers became unnecessary because the architecture trained anticipation. Servants corrected their own errors before she even noticed. Spaces became invisible teachers, embedding obedience into perception. The East Wing was a microcosm of the broader system. Control was experimental, internalized, and inescapable, even in freedom. Here is the deeper lesson: environments themselves can be agents of domination. Walls, rooms, objects, and structure communicate. They teach rules, boundaries, and hierarchies. Larkspur House exploited this principle fully, converting architecture into pedagogy, and pedagogy into identity. Observation was the silent heartbeat of Larkspur House. Eleanor Ashcombe did not need to shout or punish. She cultivated the sensation of being seen, everywhere, at all times. Servants learned quickly. Movement was never unnoticed. Glances never escaped notice. Even the smallest hesitation registered in the atmosphere. This constant surveillance, subtle yet omnipresent, reshaped thought before behavior. The mechanism was elegant. Senior servants acted as extensions of Eleanor's gaze, correcting posture, tone, and conduct. Mirrors and reflective surfaces allowed occupants to monitor themselves unconsciously. The architecture directed sightlines, ensuring that anyone entering a room felt both observed and accountable. Observation became omnipresent without the necessity of a single guard or explicit instruction. The psychological effect was profound. The servants began policing themselves. Every thought, intention, and desire was filtered through the imagined gaze of the house. Anticipation replaced spontaneity. Doubt was reframed as guilt. Deviation was corrected internally, often before an action occurred. The mind became both jailer and prisoner, maintaining compliance without external force. This is where fear merges with identity. When you internalize observation, the system no longer needs enforcement. Correction occurs silently, preemptively, and voluntarily. Obedience becomes instinctive because deviation triggers discomfort, anxiety, even moral dissonance. Eleanor's system required no punishment. It was maintained through attention alone. Historical accounts suggest that even after Eleanor's death, servants continued to behave as if the house was alive, as if eyes still followed them. Corrections persisted internally. Rituals were followed meticulously. The observation mechanism had transferred from external authority to internal governance. The house had become a mind inside each mind. Here is the chilling implication. Modern systems exploit the same principle. Constant surveillance, digital, social, or institutional, trains individuals to anticipate correction, self-police, and conform. The chain becomes invisible, defended by the very person it confines. Observation, once internalized, produces compliance without coercion. Anticipation is the invisible tether that binds the mind. At Larkspur House, Eleanor Ashcombe perfected it. Servants never knew when correction would come, when praise would arrive, or when deviation would be noticed. The unpredictability was subtle, almost imperceptible, but relentless. The mind, in its attempt to navigate uncertainty, learned to self-regulate. Compliance became preemptive. Ritualized punishment complemented this anticipation. No lashings, no dramatic confrontations. Small inconveniences, delays, or redirections, experienced repeatedly, taught servants that every action had consequence. By making correction habitual and integrated into daily routines, Eleanor ensured that obedience became instinctive. The mind calculated constantly, always predicting outcomes, always adjusting, until deviation felt unnatural. Surveillance amplified the effect. Observers, senior servants, mirrors, and architectural sightlines created an environment where attention was omnipresent. Servants did not need to be told they were being watched. The design of the house ensured it. And once the mind internalized this, observation became self-enforced. Anticipation, ritual, and attention converged, shaping both behavior and thought without ever raising a voice. The result was irreversible transformation. Servants began defending the system themselves, correcting each other, and internalizing guilt for imagined lapses. Pride in compliance replaced resentment. Identity became inseparable from obedience. The house lived in their thoughts, and leaving, even when physically possible, felt like abandoning selfhood. Freedom had been redefined as danger. This is the apex of psychological control, a system so subtle, so integrated, that it perpetuates itself through the minds of those it shapes. Eleanor's methods are ancient, refined, and terrifyingly effective. And once you recognize them, you begin to see the same patterns in modern life, workplaces, digital spaces, social networks, and institutions that rely not on force but on anticipation, observation, and internalized correction. Here is where you, the observer, must pause. Recognize the mechanisms at work in your own life. Which routines, which expectations, which anticipations shape your thoughts without your awareness? Comment once more the phrase, "I see the hidden chain," twice. Commit to awareness, because the descent into understanding Larkspur House is no longer historical. It is personal. Identity is the most dangerous weapon a system can claim. At Larkspur House, Eleanor Ashcombe did not merely enforce obedience, she made it part of the self. By entwining routine, ritual, faith, and observation with morality and purpose, she converted compliance into essence. Servants did not follow rules, they became the rules. Their sense of self aligned with the house itself. Loyalty and love were quietly enlisted. Those who excelled, who anticipated, who internalized correction, were praised, not ostentatiously, but in ways that resonated deeply. A nod, a smile, a subtle acknowledgement, small, precise, and meaningful. The mind interpreted this as affection, and affection reinforced compliance. Love became both reward and chain. Pride and alignment merged with emotional need. Obedience was no longer optional, it was cherished. Conversely, deviation generated subtle shame. Not punishment, but internal guilt. Even thinking about defiance became moral failure. The servants began policing themselves and one another, correcting posture, tone, even thought, to maintain the invisible moral order. Eleanor's presence became permanent, inhabiting their minds long after she left the room, or the world. This is why resistance was almost impossible. When identity, pride, fear, and affection converge, leaving the system feels like betrayal, not liberation. Servants defended the house, rationalized its cruelty, and even corrected newcomers in ways that perpetuated the system. Chains were gone, rooms unlocked, yet obedience persisted. The mind had become the cage. Modern parallels are unmistakable. Institutions, workplaces, social hierarchies, and digital networks replicate the same architecture. Rewards become emotional. Discipline becomes self-administered. Surveillance becomes internal. Identity is co-opted, and the individual becomes complicit, defending a system that limits freedom while believing it to be virtuous, necessary, even beloved. Now, the descent takes its final form. Understanding Larkspur House is no longer about observing history. It is about seeing the structures that shape thought today. Inside every hierarchy, every system, every human network. And once you see, there is no undoing the recognition. The psychological imprint of Larkspur House was permanent. Chains vanished. Doors unlocked. Eleanor Ashcombe passed into history. Yet those who had lived within the walls carried the house in their minds. Decisions, perceptions, even dreams were structured by its invisible architecture. Obedience had become instinct. Loyalty had become identity. Fear had become morality. Freedom was no longer a concept. It was a threat. This imprint was cumulative. Years of ritual, anticipation, surveillance, and moral framing layered upon each other to create what modern psychologists might call habitual cognition. But it was far more insidious. Habitual obedience fused with self-judgment. Deviations triggered guilt, shame, and anxiety before any external force intervened. The mind became both warden and prisoner. The servants policed themselves more strictly than Eleanor ever could. Some who left the estate carried the imprint into the outside world. They sought environments with structure, hierarchy, and predictability. They gravitated to workplaces, social circles, and communities that mirrored the control they had internalized. Even in freedom, the architecture followed them. Autonomy became uncomfortable. Uncertainty became dangerous. The invisible chains had migrated with them, reinforced by memory and identity. This is the ultimate lesson of Larkspur House. Control does not require force when it is internalized. The more invisible the mechanism, the more enduring it becomes. Once the mind adopts the logic of the system, obedience persists even without authority, punishment, or visible constraint. The cage exists not outside, but within. And this is where modern parallels are unavoidable. Think of the subtle ways systems today teach expectation, conformity, and self-correction. The patterns of observation, ritual, moral framing, and identity alignment are replicated everywhere. Every social network, every office, every ideology that shapes thought and behavior without overt coercion echoes Eleanor's architecture. The methods are the same, refined, amplified, and embedded in daily life. The descent is almost complete. Once you understand this, you cannot unsee it. You cannot pretend obedience is always voluntary, or that conformity is harmless. The next section will reveal the final layer, how Larkspur House turned compliance into devotion, and how the mind, when fully conditioned, becomes the most efficient enforcer of its own captivity. Devotion is the final stage of internalized control. At Larkspur House, Eleanor Ashcombe did not merely train obedience, she inspired reverence. When identity, ritual, moral framing, and surveillance converge, the individual begins to defend the system voluntarily, not out of fear, but out of attachment. Compliance becomes sacred. Loyalty becomes a form of love. The cage is no longer oppressive. It is essential. Servants who reached this stage did not need correction. They corrected themselves, and often corrected others. Minor deviations in posture, tone, or thought triggered immediate self-repair. Pride in alignment replaced resentment. Anticipation of punishment transformed into anticipation of belonging. The house, once a set of walls and tasks, became a living moral and psychological authority, permanently embedded in the mind. Eleanor understood the subtle power of devotion. External force is finite. Internalized reverence is boundless. When the mind defends the system, when it interprets compliance as virtue and deviation as sin, the architecture perpetuates itself. Control becomes invisible, unassailable, eternal. The system no longer relies on masters, punishment, or oversight. It survives in memory, identity, and habit. Modern parallels are everywhere. Any institution, corporation, social network, or ideology that encourages internalized self-correction, moralized obedience, and identity alignment with its principles achieves the same effect. The methods are identical to Eleanor's: subtle, invisible, and astonishingly efficient. Individuals defend their own confinement, believing it to be right, safe, and necessary. Here is the danger. Recognition is the first step to freedom, but awareness alone is uncomfortable. Once you see the architecture, you cannot unsee it. You begin to notice the invisible chains around yourself, in workplaces, relationships, and communities. The knowledge is disorienting because it reveals that obedience and loyalty can be co-opted without overt coercion, and that the mind itself can become the most efficient warden. Some who lived within Larkspur House never left, not because the doors were locked, but because their minds were. Freedom, once experienced, became threatening. Autonomy felt chaotic. The world outside lacked the structure, ritual, and moral clarity they had internalized. Even when given the opportunity to escape physically, many remained psychologically trapped, defending the very system that had confined them. This is the ultimate achievement of Eleanor Ashcombe's design: total internalization. The servant's thoughts, perceptions, and identities had been shaped so thoroughly that leaving felt like self-destruction. Guilt, anxiety, and moral reasoning fused into an invisible cage. They had learned to value the house more than themselves. Their loyalty had become instinctual. Their fear had been replaced by devotion. The permanence of this effect is chilling. Once identity aligns with control, even the absence of oversight cannot undo it. Memory, habit, and emotional conditioning sustained the architecture indefinitely. Former residents carried the house inside them, unconsciously reproducing its methods in new environments, homes, workplaces, even communities. Control spreads through the mind, invisible yet indelible. Eleanor's brilliance was that she created a system that survived her, independent of her presence. Walls, keys, and chains were secondary. The true architecture existed in perception, anticipation, and moralized identity. The house became a template for behavioral mastery, the blueprint of invisible domination. Once internalized, it is virtually impervious to critique, physical removal, or rebellion. This is where most men fail to recognize control in their own lives. They search for chains, punishments, or external authority. They ignore the subtle architecture shaping thought, self-perception, and morality. Larkspur House teaches a terrifying truth. The most efficient systems do not command, they inhabit the mind, teaching obedience as virtue and making resistance feel immoral. The descent nears its conclusion. The next section will reveal the final lesson Eleanor left behind: how invisible systems of power persist through time, spreading quietly, shaping societies, and demonstrating that mastery over the self begins with recognition of the change you cannot see. The final lesson of Larkspur House is deceptively simple. Power persists not through force, but through invisibility. Eleanor Ashcombe's system endured because it was internalized, moralized, and habitualized. The chains vanished, yet the cage remained, living inside minds, defended voluntarily, reproduced unconsciously, and revered as virtue. Modern systems mirror this principle. Hierarchies, institutions, ideologies, and social platforms rely not on explicit control but on shaping perception, expectation, and identity. Ritual, anticipation, surveillance, and moral framing persist in subtle, invisible ways. Obedience becomes instinct. Resistance feels immoral, and the individual defends the system they inhabit, often unaware of their own captivity. This is why awareness is dangerous knowledge. Recognizing the invisible architecture of control changes the way you see yourself, others, and the world. You begin to notice the anticipatory behaviors, the internalized corrections, the moralized loyalty, and the unspoken hierarchies that structure everyday life. Recognition awakens autonomy, but it also awakens discomfort. Freedom is heavy, and perception of control is unsettling. Eleanor's true genius was that she engineered self-sustaining obedience. The house was a mental machine. Each ritual, each observation, each moralized correction compounded over time, producing subjects who defended their own limitation. And once the architecture imprints itself on identity, it spreads. Former servants carried the lessons into new lives, seeding patterns of control wherever they went. The terrifying implication is clear. These invisible chains exist in every society, every organization, every human system. They endure not through threat, but through subtlety, habit, and moralized perception. They teach men to obey before they are commanded, to defend before they are challenged, and to believe before they are convinced. The apex of Larkspur House's design is terrifying in its elegance. Fear, anticipation, ritual, observation, morality, and identity converge to create a state where obedience is instinct and compliance is devotion. By the time a servant fully internalized the system, leaving was no longer a matter of doors or walls. It was a rupture of self. Freedom became unthinkable. The mind had become the warden. Obedience was no longer behavior. It was identity. Every thought, every choice, every moral judgment aligned with the house's invisible rules. Pride, guilt, and anxiety reinforced each other, forming an unbreakable feedback loop. Deviations were self-corrected before they occurred. Loyalty was instinctual. The house no longer needed Eleanor. Her principles had migrated into the minds of her subjects, perpetuated without supervision, without punishment, without chains. Devotion completed the cycle. Fear had been replaced by reverence. Compliance had become moral virtue. The servants defended the system, corrected newcomers, and even rationalized the house's most cruel mechanisms. The architecture of control had transcended the physical. The building was irrelevant. Obedience had become sacred. Identity had become the cage. Here lies the ultimate lesson for any man who seeks mastery over himself. Chains are not always visible, and cages are often mental. Institutions, ideologies, and hierarchies exploit the same mechanisms. They cultivate anticipation, ritual, observation, and moral alignment. They internalize compliance, co-opt identity, and convert obedience into devotion. The most effective control is invisible, defended by the very person it confines. Now, the choice is yours. Recognition is the first step toward autonomy. Awareness is uncomfortable because it exposes the subtle patterns that have shaped perception, action, and belief. To break free, you must observe without defending, question without rationalizing, and recognize the invisible chains in your own mind before attempting to remove them. Larkspur House is not merely a building. It is a template. It is a blueprint for domination perfected over decades, refined in secrecy, and carried forward in memory and mind. The chains were temporary. The rooms were mortal. Eleanor Ashcombe passed, but the principles endured, embedded in thought, habit, and identity. The haunting truth is that these mechanisms exist everywhere, not just in isolated estates. They shape workplaces, relationships, social networks, ideologies, and governments. Anticipation, ritual, observation, moral framing, identity alignment, and internalized devotion, the invisible cage is everywhere. Most men never see it because it feels natural, safe, even virtuous. Compliance becomes instinct. Obedience becomes devotion. The mind becomes the jailer. Understanding this is dangerous knowledge. Once recognized, it cannot be unlearned. You begin to perceive patterns, chains, and hierarchies in places you previously trusted. You notice anticipation, self-correction, moralized loyalty, and peer enforcement. Awareness awakens freedom, but it also awakens fear. Autonomy is heavy. Knowledge is power, and also responsibility. The final lesson is clear. Mastery over self begins with seeing the cage. Only then can you choose what is truly yours. Larkspur House is history, yes, but it is also a mirror. The same principles persist around you, shaping thoughts, molding identity, and teaching obedience without chains. If you have read this far, if you have acknowledged the patterns, then you have glimpsed the architecture of control. You have confronted the invisible forces shaping lives, including your own. The cage is real, but recognition is the first key to freedom. And now, the descent ends, not as a story, but as awakening. The house may stand or fall, but the knowledge you carry is permanent. What you do with it is your choice.